Good morning, everyone. I could say it's an honor, it's a privilege, but actually it's a joy to welcome you here. And it's really a joy because this project has been 2 years in the making, actually. So seeing it happen gives me joy. So the first thing I want to do is to thank Antonio Tajani, the President of the Parliament. Why is that? Because, yes, we as members of the European Parliament can enjoy these wonderful facilities, but for such big events being held outside of normal parliamentary work, this is what we call a green week, when members of the European Parliament are supposed not to be here but in their constituencies. We need the express authorization of the President of the Parliament. And I didn't have a lot of efforts to make to obtain the go-ahead from Antonio Tajani. So we are not from the same political family, but he is a President of the Parliament who wants this Parliament to be a place of debate. And I will start reading you his message. He unfortunately could not be here this week. He is actually in his constituency in Italy. And so let me read you. Dear Mr. Lamberts and assembled participants, I'd like to begin by thanking Mr. Lamberts, it's a bit awkward to say that, for organizing this important event. Economists, philosophers, social scientists and institutions have always addressed questions regarding values, growth, the distribution of wealth, and the limits imposed by nature. Since 1972, when the Limits to Growth report was first published, the debate on post-growth has been a continuous effort towards achieving a sustainable economic model. We have experienced what happens when economy does not factor in the environment and quality of life. Population, migration flows, pollution and scarcity of resources are our biggest challenges. We need to decouple GDP for environmental impact via qualitative growth by exploring appropriate technology and implementing smart designs. It is necessary to achieve sustainability. There's huge potential for efficiency improvements, both in terms of cleaner production, increased recycling, and lower impact consumer choice. Our treaty states that the European Union shall work for sustainable development. Technological innovation, circular economy, renewable energy are some examples of the right answers to these challenges. The European Union is the undisputed global leader on environmental policy and standards, as well as the fight against global warming. We should be proud of this and continue to work towards achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement. The European Parliament has reinforced its efforts in view of the COP24 that will take place in Katowice in December. The work we've done so far, for instance on extending the lifetime of plastic products, the circular economy package, energy efficiency, eco-design and sustainable finance, all go in the right direction. Our work is not finished, however. By completing the energy market and investing more to ensure a transition to clean energy, the European Parliament will bring tangible improvements to both the quality of life of our citizens and the environment. All our policies, from trade to research, energy, digital and education, should work together to achieve sustainable development. However, this may not be enough. Exploring the economic growth realities and perspective leads to post-growth thinking, new policies and institutions, different consumer approaches, new ways of living. I'm sure that this important conference will offer relevant insights for work in the future. Thank you, Antonio Tajani, President of the European Parliament. So, how did we get here today? As I said, it started 2 years ago when I was attending a post-growth conference in Budapest. And you know, I've been meeting with, say, the unorthodox economists for years, and I'm living and working in Brussels, which is a place where I would say more orthodox economic thinking takes place. And I always found that these two worlds were a bit isolated from one another, that actually it was like-minded people talking to like-minded people, and that was not really useful in terms of, forming policy making or thought forming. And therefore, the idea of having a meeting between these two worlds was born. And it took me a while, and ultimately I ventured the idea to someone who plays a very important role in the European Commission, Marco Butti. He's Director General of DG ECFIN. I don't think that he is here. I didn't see him. But if he is, congratulations for engaging. And Marco Butti immediately said, yes, let's do this. Let's do this. And that was very encouraging. Because I think that this perception that something is not going right, when we see rising inequalities and rising ecological footprint, current economic policy making doesn't seem to be able to disarm these two time bombs. And therefore, something needs to be done. And you would be surprised, and I know that when you don't work in the Brussels bubble, it may not be readily apparent, but there's a lot of head scratching here in Brussels. There's many people inside the Commission, the Parliament, the Council, who are really trying to understand what is going wrong and how to have better policy making. And so that is really the context in which this conference was born. Now, there's a good thing. We Greens, I'm leading the Green Group in the European Parliament, do not have the monopoly of thinking about these things. And that's rather reassuring, because there's not so many Greens. So if there's more people thinking about these things, it's rather encouraging. And so I teamed up with a number of members of the European Parliament whom you will meet over these 2 days from other political groups. European People's Party, European Liberals, European Socialists, European Left, and the Greens. So there's 5 groups teaming up to offer this conference. And that is very important because it's useless to be right alone. What we want is to shape policy. And this is why I think it's really a good thing that we could enlarge or should I say, the political basis of this conference. But then again, we politicians, and you won't hear me after this statement, are not here to make speeches. We will moderate. We will moderate, so the first plenary will not be moderated by an MEP, but all the workshops will be. So we are there to generate a discussion and to listen. You know, we politicians tend to speak a lot, but sometimes we need to listen if we want to do good policies. So the objective is to advance towards a better economic policy making in this body, the European Union, that has huge powers, actually. And we shouldn't forget that. We Europeans, if we want to have any sovereignty, we have to share our sovereignty, to pool it in order to really be effective. I will finish by saying that there are 3 conditions for success. This is a place of dialogue. And if we want this dialogue to be fruitful, I'd like all of us to have these 3 conditions in mind. 1, it's right to share arguments, but these have to be, as much as possible, rooted in fact and in evidence. So it's really about looking at the world as it is and trying to devise ways to make this world better. Second, yes, we should not avoid, or no, we should not avoid controversies. Because no, we do not all think the same way. And the interest, of course, is to confront different visions. But here comes the 3rd condition, and that is critical to me and to Marco and to all the people who set this up. We need the arguments to be exchanged in a respectful way. We want this to be fruitful. We don't want this to turn into a fist fight, because that would be a failure. But I don't think there will be a failure. And here's my promise to you. If this conference is successful, I'm very much motivated, and I'm sure my fellow MEPs will be, to have a second edition, I would say maybe in 2020 or 2021, when the next term will be underway. And there we might do something different. We didn't do it this time, opening up to the wider public. We did not advertise this conference so much because we were afraid of being overwhelmed. Well, we are more than 600 people enrolled here without doing a lot of publicity. But I think that this is a lively debate in society, and we might want to open up. But that's a decision that we will take further along the road. So I'll stop here. I'll hand over to Wolfgang Munchau, who is a well-known economic columnist. I will hand over to you, Wolfgang. He will chair the first panel. I'm really glad that both Margrethe Vestager, who is Commissioner for Competition, and Tim Jackson, who authored Prosperity Without Growth years ago, have accepted to come to these, to be part of this first panel and to interact with you. So I'll move to the floor, if you don't mind, and leave you in charge. Thank you very much.
Philippe, thank you very much for the introduction. I will make a very brief introductory remarks before I hand over to our two panelists. When Philippe and I discussed this conference, I thought immediately this was this is a good timing for it. I know the post-growth debate has been going on forever, and I know it dates back all the way to the 70s with various reincarnations. But this is a particularly good time because we're coming to a point where establishment people, I mean, not only the European Commission, but also, newspapers like the one I work for, have come to a point where we realize that many of these orthodox economic thoughts that have been dominant in our minds are no longer working. Paul Krugman recently had an article on, defending macroeconomics, and, many of the points he made were actually right, and I would agree with, But frankly, he defended old macroeconomics. He really didn't defend new macroeconomics. I cannot, I was still massively interested in the science and in the discipline until about 10 years ago, but realized subsequently that much of what has been found and many of the forecasts that were made and many of the thinking about our economy doesn't really help us. In my work as a columnist who writes about the European economy, I find much of the new stuff of not great value to me anymore. Old stuff still has some value, but we are now much more open to new ideas, new thinking than we ever were. And that's why these conferences like these are of such importance, not because, there may be a sea change of thinking, because it comes at a good time. My only word of advice would be to rethink the kind of tax, the kind of post-growth name. There are people around, not just people like me, slightly conservative people, but people who would immediately get an allergic reaction when they hear the word post-growth. It reminds them of the 70s. Some people have been around for that time. The Club of Rome prediction of, and you probably, or many of you are probably not in exactly the same tradition of the Club of Rome views of the 1970s, even though you might have still be linked to it. This isn't entirely about resource, deprivation, about the growth, the low growth that comes because we've run out of oil and coal and steel and whatever, materials we have. But, the growth, that seems to have been, much of those claims seems to have been also refuted, not only by evidence, but also on factual grounds. But there is obviously more than a kernel of truth to this post-growth thing, because the question of how do we define growth, and do we talk about GDP growth, do we talk about growth in qualitative terms, the word growth may still be justifiable, but if you want to interlink into a wider public debate beyond this conference hall, my recommendation would be to change the language. But with that short introduction, I would like to hand over to the Commissioner.
Well, thank you. Also, thank you for these nuances. But first of all, thank you to Philippe Lamberts for inviting me, because I'm also intrigued and interested in these ideas of making people come together from different points of view to see how to enable another future. And I couldn't agree more with what Philippe said. Well, it doesn't make any sense to be right on your own or be right and be an absolute minority, because it will be the majority who changes things. So we need to figure out how to talk with one another in a way that we design new ways of doing things. And I think it is indeed very timely, because I have the same experience that things are being questioned in a different way, that things are being considered. And just to spoil alert my speech here, if I were to devise a model of how to deal with a better future, that model would be the model of the 17 Sustainability Development Goals. That makes a model that's sufficiently complex, and that sort of gives us substance to work with. But before getting to that conclusion, the thing for me is that you see sort of economic and societal interactions almost everywhere. If you had the time, as I sometimes have, to stop at a braderie here in one of the Brussels neighborhoods, you would find that this is a very, very lively occasion. There are local businesses who put their stalls out in the streets. There will be eat and drink and setups where children can play. It's a modern mix of cultures and languages. It's the sort of thing that has been going on in Belgian villages for centuries. And when I look around and I see all this variety and all the life around me, well, the thing is that this is also an expression of how miraculously an economy can be. Because it takes a lot of people to enable one of you or me to have a bite to eat from one of those stalls. Farmers who grew the vegetables that I was eating, the truck driver who brought them to the door of the restaurant, the designer who created the truck, the programmer who wrote the design program, the restaurant where that coder had his or her dinner. All of those people doing their job, living their own lives, very often, I think in most cases, completely unaware of one another. And that is why when we talk about the problems of our economy, for me the important thing is to have a full picture. Because the economy and all our other societal interactions, they are intertwined. Now, again, we as societies face big challenges, not only in Europe, but also globally. And part of solving that challenge is to use the market in the way the market can be helpful. Back in the very days, the founders of what is now the European Union, they took also the markets and put it in as part of the puzzle to make peace in Europe and to frame it in ways as to how this market should work. Because they saw what happened if you let go. You saw the negative impacts of monopolies of the 30s. But they thought of the market as parts of the puzzle to improve people's lives, to rebuild Europe, and to develop Europe as an epicenter of peace and prosperity and welfare. There's a lot to do. I think the majority of people that you will meet over this two-day conference, they will agree that we need to build a sustainable future, and we need to build a future where people feel that they have a fair chance. And we've seen that over the years, research that shows us that our economies are getting more unequal in the decades that has gone by. We also know that too many people who work, it can be in poor countries, but it's definitely also here in Europe, they cannot be absolutely certain of having a fair pay for the work they do to create value, nor that their working conditions are sufficiently healthy. I think that what we have experienced this summer has made it obvious to anyone doubtful that climate change is not some remote thing. It is right here, it is right now. We cannot only avoid it, we also have to adjust to some of the effects that are already happening. And we know that if everything else still stays the same, growth could make the problem worse. We know that as more things are produced and consumed, we can just end up with even more carbon emissions, more air pollution, more plastic ruining our oceans, of course, unless we change things. The thing is, if we are discussing the right thing, if sort of what we're discussing is how to slow down growth. Because the risk is that we have more to lose than what we have to gain in qualifying what we want to do. In the 15 years from 2000 to 2015, the drive to fulfill the UN Millennium Goals have almost half the rate of maternal death in childbirth. So that on this very day, over 600 more babies, will be born with mothers who are alive, compared to what was the situation in just the year 2000. In 2015, nearly 2 billion more people, they will have access to piped drinking water than 25 years before. And that was possible, those two achievements, and both achievements I find to be amazing. They are thanks to growth. Thanks to the fact, for example, that African countries grew an average of more than 5% in each year of the first decade of this century. This is among one of the reasons why the President Juncker, in his speech of the Union, said that the relationship between European countries and African countries, Europe and Africa, needs to be a partnership that makes people's lives better. So we are proposing an alliance for sustainable investment and jobs to create as many as 10 million jobs in Africa, in African countries, in just the next 5 years, for people to be able to provide for themselves. But the thing is that it's not just a question of the poorest countries on earth. It is also a question for us how to improve people's lives. Here in Europe, it is growth that has given us the resources to improve better healthcare, education, better ways to communicate with access to more knowledge than ever in human history. And growth and the efficiency that comes with it is one of the drivers to innovate in order to do some of the things that we need to meet our challenges. There are obvious things that need to be done, more efficient ways to use energy, to meet the targets set by now a majority here in Parliament and Council. It's the equivalent, I think, of turning off 400 power stations, and to hit even tougher targets by 32% by 2030. And that, of course, takes innovation. Otherwise, it is not possible. Innovation that makes renewable energy affordable, the sort of innovation that already cost the cost of generating electricity by solar panels by 85% the last 7 years. So, in my opinion, we cannot just answer the problems we face by throwing away our growing market economies. But of course, it all depends on how you define it. Because we can steer our economies in the right direction. We can build an economy that's sustainable, and we can do that because it is achievable. We've seen this before because we have done it before. Today, European workers, they are much more safe and secure in their employment than their grandparents were, and maybe more than they ever imagined it possible. EU employment laws guarantee them a safe working environment, equal pay, fair working hours, freedom from discrimination. And at the very same time, the resources that they were part of creating have helped us all live better, longer, healthier lives. And time again, our democracies have found ways to deal with new threats. In 1985, a team of scientists, they reported the discovery of a hole in the planet's ozone layer over Antarctica. Just 2 years later, the world's governments had agreed on a ban of the CFC gases that were causing the hole, a ban that made these gases disappear, and now the hole is well on its way to recovery. So how to meet today's challenges? Well, the thing is that just because things are possible is not necessarily a necessary condition for them to be put into work. Because these laws that improved working conditions, the laws that improved our environment, the goals now set to minimize our carbon emissions, they only happened because people fought for them. Politicians, governments, NGOs, campaigners, unions, they never stopped to campaign for better ways of doing things. And that, of course, is a lesson learned. We can only change things if we really want to do it, not just because that it is doable. And this is why a conference like this can make an enormous contribution by bringing together economists, policy experts to think about a better, fairer, more sustainable economy and what it should look like. And the thing is, of course, we need then to know what we are doing, and we need to do it together. I used to, before I became Commissioner and Commissioner of Competition, to be the Minister of Economics and the Interior in Denmark. And one of the things that we put in effect was to develop a green GDP in order to have a better and more full view of the resources actually being used. And we also developed and installed what we called a poverty line, both relative and in absolute terms, so that we would actually know how people were living, not just on averages, but also how the people in the most vulnerable position, how they were doing, in order, of course, to make policy choices on base of these insights. The government who's now in charge in Denmark, they closed both projects, but on developing a green GDP and developing a green reform tool, now one of the Danish foundations has stepped in to finance this work. And this is a very good example of the fact that this is not done by this government or that government or those politicians or other politicians. This is done when people come together. In this example, very clever, far-seeing economists and foundations, but unions, business, anyone who can take actions are more than welcome in doing this. Cities, of course, you probably know very well The Climate of Hope by Mike Bloomberg and Carl Pope, which has also two unlikely allies coming together in showing how we can change if we do come together. And they do that because they have an undogmatic approach to enable things. So they don't scare anyone away to say you're not welcome because you don't share the true belief. And when I look at the people in that braderie, those who are doing their business, those who are selling food and drink, I wonder exactly if some of the basic principles of old school economics are right. That people, they are economic agents for their own benefit. Because I think there's so much more to it than your own benefit. People are taking actions, doing their job, doing their best, because of a whole range of human impulses. Because we are humans and not agents. And the concept of rationality has to be understood in a much, much broader way if we want to understand what change we can set afloat when we have a true understanding of what makes human activity and what a sustainable future is. And in doing that, we have majorities taken decisions that the global sustainability development goals, they are what we want to do. And here we have a very good start because the majority has already obliged themselves to follow this model. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Before I hand over to Tim, may I ask you one question?
Sure.
A specific one on competition policy in particular. Is it possible or feasible or desirable to introduce a formal sustainable development function in the assessment of competition policy decisions, for example, on blocking a merger on the grounds that it may not be, conducive to sustainable development or state aid, beyond just consideration, but also in the form of a sort of a clear legal mandate?
Well, I think it's more important that things at the same time have to fulfill more than one thing. Because what we can look at, we go through many, many documents. And if you ask people who have been through merger control, they say, oh my God, the type of questions they ask. Sometimes we go through hundreds of thousands of internal documents to figure out what are the real plans of this merger, in order for customers to have someone else to turn to. That is sort of what triggers our concern. It is if we as customers has no one else to turn to. But what is important for us is that we have strong obligations that you have to fulfill at the same time. Because I think it will be too much if we put it all in the same basket. Because you can have a competitive market that is still not sustainable. And since we do not go through any merger, and businesses who don't merge, we don't go through, then you would, I think, weaken our ability to set environmental goals, sustainability goals. But competition law enforcement can work also outside of enabling choice and affordable prices and innovation. We are opening today a case of German car makers because we have the suspicion that they have colluded on not using the best possible technology to limit air pollution. And this is a new thing, because this is not a suspicion of collusion on setting prices or disabling choice as such. This is a case of saying we have this suspicion that you have agreed not to use the best possible technology to limit air pollution from diesel cars and cars driven on, what is the English term? Both ways of having an engine. And this is in order to say, well, having a cartel is much more than just agreeing on prices. And in that respect, I think that competition law enforcement can play its role. Just as way as it can play its role in making sure that our markets do not concentrate so much that all value is just pushed up. We see that from data in the US. At least we think that there is a relationship between concentration in markets and then profits sort of moving upwards. We also have numbers for Europe, but we are trying to substantiate that. That shows that the rate of profit has risen from 8 to 12% over the last 20 years, measured in terms of GDP. And that may not sound as huge numbers, but it's still an increase of 50%. And that's suggesting that the ones creating value by working in the businesses are not being remunerated in the same manner. And coming from a country where you have very strong social partners to negotiate how to make sure that both the one who owns the business and the capital, but also those who create value by their working efforts, gets remunerated for the value that they produce. That, of course, is worrying if you see that as a tendency. And that, of course, will take strong competition law enforcement so that you don't get these very concentrated markets that can be more difficult to then govern in the framing of the market in terms of environment, sustainability, working condition, health, that sort of things.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And I'll hand over to Tim.
Thank you very much. It's a huge pleasure to be here. And a seminal point, I think, both in European politics and indeed in debates about growth. It isn't quite the first time that a parliamentary initiative has addressed the growth question, but it's certainly the most significant in terms of its timing and indeed the scale that Philippe and his co-organisers are aiming for. So it's a real pleasure to be here. It feels a little bit like a moment in history. coming as it does almost exactly 10 years after the collapse of Lehman Brothers on the 15th of September 2008, and almost exactly after 50 years after Robert Kennedy, in a speech at the University of Kansas, set out some of the limitations of not just the GDP as a measure, but in fact the concept of growth and the role that plays in social progress in our society. So it's extraordinary what Philippe has done, and I'm really, really pleased to be here. I'm also pleased to be here with Margrethe. She had some concerns before we started the session that I was a proper economist and she wasn't an economist, and so it wouldn't be appropriate to have a debate. But actually, as I listened to her and agreed more and more with the things that she was saying, I began to realize two things. One is that I had to find the grit in the oyster, something to disagree with. But the second was that actually Margrethe is an economist. She thinks in terms of the human economy. She thinks about the way that people interrelate in that economy. She thinks about the role of the state in that economy. She is the competition commissioner for the European Union, but she sees her role not just as making sure that prices are right, but actually that the economy is fair. And that is absolutely the fundamental foundation for a post-growth economic. So welcome to the club, Margrethe. You're no longer able to use that line to resist argument. But there isn't so much in the way of argument, but there is a little. And let me therefore come to what I see as the nub of it, which actually, strangely, even though both Margrethe and Wolfgang, to some extent, have warned us against it, it is the question of the G word. It is the question of whether or not we talk about growth and whether or not we can have a debate about a post-growth economy, about a post-growth economics. So it might seem as though, and I was delighted to hear Margrethe talk about the green GDP work that was done previously in Denmark and the work that's being funded by the foundation, Danish foundation now, partly because I've had some involvement in both those things. It may seem as though we can simply redefine growth, that we can think of it in different ways, that we can begin to measure something slightly differently, and I do think that measurement problem is important, but that we can somehow retain the growth word, because it's such an important word, because it matters so much to politicians. It's how economists understand economics. It's surely how parents understand the progress of their children up to a certain age. We want them to grow. We want things to grow. And that sense of wanting things to grow actually has such a symbolic significance that there is a widespread affiliation. There's a widespread desire to keep that word in our vocabulary and to keep that word in our politics. And I don't want to go too much into the sort of psychological reasons why we do that, because when you think about it a little bit longer, there is an alternative side to that. The planet does not grow. The planet is finite. The ecosystems do not grow. They have symbiotic relationships in and around growth and degrowth and post-growth. Children also don't grow endlessly. And the things mostly that do grow in our societies without end tend to end up killing their host. So the growth, there's a dark side to the growth model. And that dark side, I think, is something that has begun to inhabit the economics of growth. It's begun to inhabit the politics of growth. And it's very difficult to see exactly where that started happening, because I absolutely agree with Margrethe that the benefits that growth has brought in human development up to a certain point are enormous indicators of social progress. The reduction in infant mortality, the reduction in maternal morbidity, the extension of the life expectancy of human beings, the access to sanitation, to clean sources of energy and water, the good nutrition that we, for the most part in the EU, although not all of us, tend to take for granted. These are the products of what at first sight looks like an incredibly successful system of delivering to human beings the needs that will make their lives full, satisfying, healthy, and long. And there's also no doubt in my mind that in the poorest countries of the world, those advances are still absolutely necessary. So where is the dark side of the growth story when it comes to economics? A couple of people have alluded to 1972 and the limits to growth work of the Club of Rome. And Wolfgang suggested actually that some of that work is, has been debunked in scientific terms, partly as a result of the continuation of resources beyond horizons that the Club of Rome foresaw. Actually, most of the evidence suggests that the Club of Rome predictions are not so far off as we might like to think, that that comforting picture of the Club of Rome having got it wrong actually doesn't quite bear scrutiny. And in fact, many people thought the Club of Rome was saying that things would get bad and run out by the year 2000, and after that there would be chaos and destruction. They never said that. They talked about economies running into resource limits in the 2030s, 2040s. And they talked about a dynamic, which was the dynamic of what happens to economies, not as resources disappear altogether, but as resources become more difficult to extract from the environment, to process in the economy, and to turn into useful goods and services. And essentially what happens is, it's very easy to think about. You mine the richest seams first, and it doesn't take much to get at it. Coal was lying around on the beaches of the north of England at a certain point in history. It no longer is. You have to dig deeper for it. You have to use more energy to get to it. You have to build better machines to get to it. And all of that in itself takes energy. So as the resources decline, the problem already arises that you cannot be so productive in your economy if you're diverting more energy into the extraction of those resources and the building of the kit to capture sunlight, for example, or wind energy. You cannot be so productive with the rest of your economy, and you begin to go into what ecological economists would call the net energy cliff, where essentially you get a feedback, which means that you're diverting so much of your resources to the energy issue itself that you're no longer able to direct those resources so efficiently to health, to education, to nutrition, to well-being, to the benefits that we take for granted. That dynamic has not gone away, whatever anybody says about the Limits to Growth report, but another one has come at us in the meantime, and we know that very well. It was lovely to hear, of course, about the ozone layer and the success of policy, global policy in addressing that, but the single biggest challenge that we face at the moment is climate change, and there the challenge is much, much more significant. Most of the nations of the world have now signed up to the Paris Agreement. One of them has signed up and then removed themselves from it. The thrust of the Paris Agreement, though, is extraordinary: to reduce anthropogenic warming to less than 2%, and with a desire to get it below 1.5% of pre-industrial global temperatures, is an extraordinary target. And it involves essentially getting our fossil fuel-based economies to a carbon zero position by 2050 at the very latest. And for developing countries, taking Margareta's point that development is most needed in the poorest countries of the world, where there is inevitably a carbon uplift as you move through that process, the developing countries have a much more fundamental obligation, a responsibility, I would say, to move towards that target faster. In fact, there's very strong arguments to say that we in the developing countries should be at net carbon zero within the space of a decade or so if we want to reach that 1.5, if we're serious about that 1.5 target. So these are formidable objectives, and the only way that we could achieve them would be through a degree of technological improvement and institutional change that would allow us to entirely decouple our economic output, the dollar of GDP across the world, entirely decouple that from the energy source of carbon-based fossil fuels and the emissions that are associated with that. Philippe implored us to look at evidence and fact, and I've spent quite a lot of time looking at that particular fact, and it's hugely ambitious, the rates at which you have to decarbonize the economy if you still want it to be growing at 2% per year, are in the double digits per year, and that's something we've never ever achieved. The closest we got to it, interestingly enough, was during the period of the oil crises in the 1970s and 80s, and that was our highest rate of decarbonisation of the dollar GDP across the advanced nations, and it's the highest rate that's ever been achieved, even with some of the amazing advances that are possible. So fact, evidence, history suggests that there is still a coupling between our carbon emissions and the GDP output. And that surely is the first, not the only, but the first, and one of the most important reasons for saying, can scale continue in the way that we assumed it would continue in a growth-based economy? There's another interesting dynamic that arose during the oil crisis. And to be honest, the evidence on this is not absolutely clear. But the clarity of one particular part of that evidence is actually fairly difficult to avoid, which is that the 1960s and 1970s were a peak in the productivity growth of advanced economies. So the productivity growth, labour productivity growth in particular, is one of the most fundamental underlying features of the growth-based economy. If you have labour productivity growth, and even if you have a constant population and labour productivity growth, then your GDP output goes on going up. If your labour productivity growth is declining, there comes a point, of course, at which chasing after GDP growth at the aggregate gets more and more difficult. You either have to have more and more people moving into the economy, which of course we have had to some extent, or you have to have people working longer and longer hours in the economy, which interestingly, in the last few years, we have also had. So this idea actually that labour productivity is declining is the second and incredibly fundamental reason for thinking about a post-growth economy. In fact, if you do some very simple extrapolations, you find that the labour productivity growth in the OECD nations is exhausted in about a decade, slightly less. In my country, labour productivity growth appears to be exhausted almost now. The decline in labour productivity growth has been dramatic, and most people attribute this, and this is entirely wrong, to the financial crisis. They think about it in terms of debt overhangs, of fiscal imbalances. They think about it in terms of the shock of the crisis, the loss of confidence, the absence of investment. When you look at the evidence, as Philippe asked us to do, you find that it started in the 1960s and 70s. It was not held up by the digital revolution. It was not held up by having very, very clever computers and more automation. It wasn't held up by the carbon revolution. The carbon revolution didn't make the economy more labour productive. And so this second challenge, this secular stagnation challenge, is to me emerging as the most forceful, the most important, the most resonant, politically resonant challenge, and the strongest reason for thinking about a post-growth economy. You know, if you're in a place where you suddenly see that your resource base is diminishing, or you look around you and see that your ability to do things technically is declining, I mean, actually all you have to do is to get older, and that will come to you as an experience. You do not adapt to that by trying to run faster and faster. You adapt to that by thinking about the change in those circumstances and what that now means for your well-being as a human being, as a society, as an economy. And so the idea that we should look at this decline in productivity growth, this rise in carbon emissions, the huge targets that we have to address, and think of that purely in terms of stimulating more growth, of getting more productivity, of squeezing more out of people, of getting our nurses to work, see more and more patients through the day, and our teachers to see more and more students and bigger class sizes, and the London Philharmonic Orchestra to play Beethoven's Fifth Symphony faster and faster each year. There is a dysfunctionality in that vision. It's the same dysfunctionality that obsesses about the idea of growth. The third imperative, and I think it is an imperative, comes from the question of inequality. The principal justification for a growth-based theory is the idea, and actually Robert Kennedy's brother, John Kennedy, was the first to formulate that, to express that a rising tide lifts all boats. As long as everything is growing, then it doesn't matter too much what's happening as long as that growth continues to raise the living standards of the poorest. Evidence again. If you look at growth in the period after the Second World War until about 1980, that trickle-down was happening, both across nations and within nations. The benefits of growth were going to the poorest in society. This is largely Thomas Piketty's work, and it's really worth looking at as a part of the evidence base. Post-1980, that position totally changed. So it is, since 1980, the richest, not just 10%, not even 1%, but 0.001% of the population who had the biggest benefits in terms of that growth. And that has created huge inequalities in society. And it brings me back, in fact, to another point that Margareta made incredibly well. Why is this profit rate such an important part of the dynamic that we're looking at? In economics, in neoclassical economics in particular, wage rate should follow labour productivity growth. So if you see labour productivity growth beginning to decline, one of the biggest casualties, the first potential casualties is the wage rate of ordinary people. If things follow what neoclassical economics tells us that we should do. In fact, we began to see that decline in the growth of the wage rate following the 1960s and 1970s, but we began to see actually worse than that the growth in the wage rate declined below the growth in labour productivity, even though labour productivity itself was declining. So you have a set of people reliant on giving their labour, contributing their labour to society, not only being told that they should now accept a lower growth in that wage, they should accept the fact that your wages are chained to labour productivity growth and therefore you can't have any more, but actually a wage growth rate suppressed below labour productivity growth. And that is the disenfranchisement of working populations. That is a rise in inequality that we see played out in the statistics, particularly in the advanced economies. It's a recipe for instability, not just in economic terms, but also in political terms. These are the fundamental challenges that Philippe, in this remarkable initiative, has brought to the attention not just of an energized public who have been thinking about them for much longer, but also to parliamentarians, to politicians, to those who stand in a position of being able to enact policies to make our economy and our world a better one. Many of those are young people, I should say, and on their behalf, at least partly, I'd like to just bring your attention very quickly to a huge petition that has been gathering momentum on the back of an open letter signed by 238 academics yesterday. And it is really a call, a very precise call, for Europe to end the growth fetish, the growth dependency that has driven inequality, exacerbated environmental damage, and indeed destabilized our economies, and to begin to think in constructive terms about a post-growth economy. There are 4 specific calls in the letter, for the European Parliament to establish a post-growth commission, for us to begin to measure what matters, the green GDP that Margareta was talking about before, for example, to move from stability and growth as a pact in the EU to stability and well-being, and perhaps to think about member countries in the EU. I pause for a moment of mourning and sadness in relation to my own country, to build ministries for economic transition. Our challenge is to transition to a sustainable, low-carbon economy that is fairer for everyone. So on behalf of those young people, in particular Dr. Dan O'Neill and Federica De Maria, I'd like to present both Wolfgang and Margareta with a copy of the signed letter and invite all of you to sign the petition that supports this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Before I open the discussion to the floor, I have one question for you. Many of the economic functions of the EU in particular are not only premised on growth, but they're actually concretely premised on GDP growth. For example, the European Central Bank's 2% inflation target. Would we still want this when we're dealing in a post-growth environment? Or the fiscal targets that foresee a certain fiscal deficit that was premised on a nominal GDP growth assumption made a long time ago. So the assumption that the idea of a post-growth environment would have very deep implications for many of the policy functions that we are undertaking. On those two specific ones, which are obviously deeply enshrined in law, they cannot just, this is not a policy thing, we can't just change it because we just changed the adoption of a couple of definitions. It requires treaty change, really big stuff. Yeah. What do you think we need to do then?
The silver lining in Brexit, and maybe you've just identified it for me. To the extent that some of those things are enshrined, for example, in the Maastricht Treaty, you're absolutely right. This is a huge challenge. Should we simply sort of neglect that challenge? I mean, I think your question had sort of two thrusts, really. One was philosophical. If we're questioning the GDP, what do we do about these relationships? And it's very complex, I think, the answer to that, because it doesn't, in my view, though I know there are others who would disagree with me, but in my view, the GDP still matters. It doesn't matter as an indicator of progress. It doesn't matter necessarily an indicator of economic wealth. It misses out all the damage it's creating on the way, but the GDP is a functional organizational tool for understanding the structural stability of the economy. And the extent to which some of our structural indicators are related to that indicator, that the GDP is an indicator, we would certainly still want to be interrogating that particular relationship. But we also may want to change that relationship. So, for example, the fiscal target in relation to GDP may be completely inappropriate if what your deficit is doing is funding a low-carbon infrastructure that brings positive social, environmental, and potentially financial benefits back into the country at a later point in time. So simply to take these coded targets as the appropriate focus for either inflation targeting or the fiscal deficit, I think is profoundly wrong. And I know that there are people in Europe, in the European debate in particular, who would very much take that view and argue that those parts of those treaties that tie us to this outmoded way of thinking about the economy and the stability of the economy are ripe for change. That's a political change that has to happen within Europe, and yes, it may actually at some point mean some change at the level beyond policy, and that is coded in treaty and is coded in legality. To me, the problems that the Eurozone faces at the moment, that almost seems inevitable, that idea that we have to look beyond certainly member state policy.
All right. Thank you very much. Questions. I have quite a few. I have the first question in the first row. Please, could you state your name, affiliation, and also to whom you address the question?
I'm Molly Scott-Cato. I am an MEP, so I'm going to be very brief. I just want to carry on from what you were saying, which really takes us to this question of the need for a total paradigm shift. And as a politician here, I'm just making an appeal to everybody who's thought very hard about these issues to try and make your discussions and your proposals practical in terms of what we can actually do here, as you did in your question, because we're existing in a completely hostile paradigm, as I think you know. And I would like to focus your minds on the idea of a transitional demand, which is a policy shift that makes sense within the existing paradigm, but if you introduced it, it would then completely change the paradigm from within. And some examples I think are useful are basic income, which changes the way we think about the labour market, public banking, which changes the ownership of the money that's created, and stranded assets. And if you haven't looked at it already, please look at what we're doing on the sustainable finance agenda and improve it. And this conference is not about personal consumption, it's about system change. But if you forgot to bring a water bottle, I'm giving away some like this. So find me after the session. Thank you.
Thank you. We had further questions over there. I'm just grabbing. Okay, we have quite a few questions in that area as well. Please, go ahead.
Hello, my name is Dirk van Orshoven. I'm an independent engineer here in Belgium, and I would like to react to the original question in the introduction that the moderator, Mr. Munchau, asked about growth and the word growth and post-growth, and picking up what the two speakers said. First of all, Mr. Jackson made the comparison with children. They grow, but at a certain age we stop growing. At 18 or so, we don't grow taller. But I think we keep evolving. We still do higher studies. We grow intellectually. We have our development. Through our social interaction in private life and public life, we grow socially. Through our professional life, we gain experiences. So we still develop. That's another kind of growth for me. And so from an economic and physical point of view, I would see it, for me, growth is not purely quantitative. It's also a matter of qualitative. What is the quality of our economy? So stop growing quantitatively, consuming more energy, consuming more materials, will not necessarily or probably not increase our happiness anymore, because we already have achieved quite a comfortable level of living. So I think the wording for me, it's still growth, but it's a different content of growth. So beyond quantitative growth towards qualitative growth. That would be my spontaneous reaction to this issue of terminology.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think what's already becoming apparent from the two questions we have a discussion of substance, but also a question of communications. And that's something we need to probably also talk about or take into account. As if one wants to sell a policy agenda, one would probably need to think about the use of words perhaps more carefully. There was a gentleman over there.
Yeah, my name is Lino, and I'm just a concerned citizen. The Commissioner rightly spoke about the need for action and for undogmatic approaches to be leaders of a sustainable world. My question to all the panelists and to this community is that how can we do more? Before getting your perspective, I'd just like to make a short call to mobilize this audience for tomorrow, if I may. Last week, the German regional government ordered to cut the forest of Ambach to expand a coal mine, and a wave of civil disobedience is now happening in the region and in Europe. And we are a group of citizens from Brussels, and we invite all of you to a short but powerful protest tomorrow at the German Regional Government Office, which is just 5 minutes from here. And so just join us and meet us tomorrow. We will meet Wednesday morning at 8:40 sharp in front of the entrance today, and we will be back in time for the second day of the conference. And we really hope that many of you can join us tomorrow at 8:40 in front of this building, because we believe that no fairer society is possible in a world that is constantly warming. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Question over there and then over there. Oh, I have to close my own mic. I'm so sorry.
Oh, right, okay. Right, does this work now? Okay, great. Thanks very much. Yes, I've got a question on for the panel, basically on the sort of practical tools for the way forward. I think that's a question raised. And one of the most important levers, sorry, I'll say who I am. I'm Patrick Tembrick of the European Environmental Bureau, an NGO that represents 140 NGOs across Europe. One of the levers in the Commission is the European budget. And you've mentioned today issues of climate, and the European budget proposal has some aspects of climate integration. But this practical tool doesn't really go far enough for 1.5 degrees. It doesn't really go far enough for decoupling, resource efficiency, or indeed the SDG integration. So the question I've got is, the negotiations are still on. Do you feel that there's hope that this tool, one of the most important levers, can still be moved in that direction? Or should we wait for the next budget? And in case that's too negative a comment, and what other tools would you wish to put on the table that can actually make the transition that we talk about? Thank you.
Sorry. Does it work now? Yes, okay. Christian Felber, Economy for the Common Good movement. I have a double question to the Commissioner. And I'd like to start with your introductory comment on the term of degrowth, post-growth. I fully agree because degrowth or post-growth is not a vision. It's not a goal in and of itself, let alone a value. Same with degrowth. Both are at best strategies to achieve or reach the appropriate scale. A goal in and of itself could be well-being, and that's why a well-being economy alliance has been started, and I hope that the degrowth movement can join the well-being economy alliance. And if you look at constitutions of democratic countries, there is an overarching goal for economic activities, which is, according to constitutions, the common good. So there is already not only a vision, which is a goal in and of itself, which is a value, which is a fundamental value, the common good, but also there can't be too much of the common good, same as there can't be too much of well-being. So with well-being or the common good, we will never have a growth problem because there can never be too much of well-being or the common good. That's why the common good economy movement has developed a common good exam for investments, a common good balance sheet for companies, and a common good product for national economies. Because success correctly is measured according to the achievement of the goal and not first and foremost according to the accumulation of the means. And it was already Aristotle who said, if you look first at the financial return on investment, the financial profit or GDP, you by definition are not an economist. You're the opposite of an economist. You're a crematist, which today we call a capitalist. Somebody who looks first at the common good, according to Aristotle, and according to our constitutions, is a true economist. And companies are already doing a common good balance sheet, which result is a maximum of 1,000 common good points. Now my first question to the Commissioner. The companies with the best scores have higher costs because they pay better wages, they provide higher social security, they apply the best available environmental standards, they have higher costs and higher prices on the market than companies that are dumping in all disciplines. And my question is, isn't this the most dramatic imaginable distortion of competition, that those companies that are respecting our fundamental, our constitutional values have a structural competitive disadvantage towards the dumpers in all disciplines? And isn't competition policy about fixing this structural problem in markets? And I'm already stopping. I'm just asking. There is an opinion of the Economic, Social and Committee which has been approved by 86% to include the economy for the common good in the legal framework of the European Union. And I just want to ask if this opinion has reached the Commission. Thanks.
Okay, good morning. My name is Ana Margarida Esteves. I'm a former European Commission official now working at the European University Institute of Lisbon as a researcher. My question is about actually the kind of social paradigm which underlies current thinking about degrowth and transition at the European Commission. What relevance is being given to the idea of the commons in lieu of a kind of individualistic paradigm that takes into account only one single household or one single family units in terms of usage of cars, of electrical appliances and so on, which are very heavy in terms of energy consumption? I wonder to what extent it has been considered to think about the support to collective transport and commons-based housing policies or usage of electrical appliances or other goods which guarantee the current standard of life, or a so-called Western standard of life. Thank you. Sorry? Off?
Yes, I'm Martin Schmalzried. I work for Families Europe, which is a European NGO. I just had a quick question on what got us here in terms of growth. And if you consider this aspect, for instance, did you consider the impact of how money is created, monetary policy, how money is created, and its link to growth? Because obviously, if you create money as credit, and then you need to repay in a certain interest rate, and money is constantly created and destroyed all the time, and you have an interest rate to repay, you need to sell more stuff. You need to actually produce more things. So how do you transition from a monetary system and a financial system which forces growth in a certain extent, to something where you have, a different kind of money creation, and then goes to the idea of basic income, the idea of monetary policy?
Thank you very much. I think that's... Sorry? Well, we have a lot of people who call. Please ask your question, but I need to. I'm not cutting anyone off in particular. It's just that we have a lot of people who want to talk. And can I suggest you keep it brief because we have to cut it off at 11:30. Otherwise, we have no way of responding.
It's possible to talk? Thank you. I think that you have a problem. I'm a member of the Union of Spain, and I am an economist, and I feel that when we talk about productivity, we have some problems to understand what is happening in the new rich economy. In the rich economies, in the rich societies, there is a new productivity that is linked to the quality of the products, linked to the art of value of the products, or linked to the emotional value of the products, not linked with the cuts of costs or with the cut of labor cost. And if we take in account this new productivity that is less material than the old productivity, one very important thing is to have in mind that we must increase wages and we must increase number of jobs. This is the question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me get the panelists to respond to probably a subset of those questions. Thank you. Commissioner?
Yes, and some of them I'd happily leave to Tim, because, for instance, on the last question of how to deal with new ways of understanding productivity, I don't know the answer to that. Of course, it is an intriguing debate, this about growth, post-growth, degrowth. The problem is I don't really get it. I'm much more sort of a practical person. Let's do something about it. Because we need systematic change. Of course, we need, as individuals, to do what we can do. But first and foremost, as Molly said, we need systematic change. And it takes some time to put that in motion in our democracies. And this is why it is important, of course, to have the debate about degrowth, post-growth, wording, I don't know, to put things into action. I think that's the important point. And of course, there comes a question of how patient should one be. Take the question of coal, which is of utmost importance. The use of coal, fossil fuel, it's a huge challenge to the entire transition of the European energy system. But this is why our heads of state and government decided more than 10 years ago that you cannot give rescue aid to ailing coal mines. You can give aid to close coal mines and to help workers get new skills, to invest in the regions, for new sorts of businesses to grow, for people to be able to make a living when unsustainable coal mines are being closed. That doesn't change the fact that since coal is still in demand from some power plants, you still find coal mines that are not ailing. But as one sort of evidence of the fact that also majorities take sort of forward-reaching decisions to say, well, we're actually in a transition mode. We're transitioning out of coal and out of fossil fuels to make the transition happen. On the question on the European budget for the next 7 years, the Commission has made a proposal. I think it's about 40% mainstreamed versus climate change and environment in total. And now it's up for debate. Of course, it's not been passed yet. We are working as much as we can in order to pass it. Among other things, that is one of the things I really do care a lot about, is to invest more in research, innovation and development. We want to go from 60-something to 100 billion euros over 7 years. So we are actually pushing. So it's now. It's now one discusses in member states, among members of parliament, what should the next 7-year budget look like. And it's just not set in stone because it's a proposal. And I think it's important to take part in that discussion now, because 7 years is a long time before one can have a full go on a 7-year budget. So it is highly likely that it can be better. We have tried to balance things and put a proposal on the table that's now to be debated. I think we can do much more. And a number of the things that we have been working with, they're not yet passed. And since they're not passed as legislative measures, they're not implemented either. Take the question of circular economy and creating commons. We have sort of made the communication to say, well, we think that this is one of the sustainable ideas that we need, that you can have a common of tools, issues that you use. But the other side of that coin is that we say, well, the kind of commons like Uber and Airbnb, who also uses common resources, they have to be a member of our society. They have to pay taxes. They have to take care of their customers. They have to compete on fair terms with others who are in the same business. No matter that it's a very good thing, that housing can be used more and cars can be used more, but there's a limit to everything. And I think that balance is very important to keep. Which is why a lot of cities are doing something about it. But that being said, to be able to share things, that's part of the solution. As you gave the obvious solutions. What I think is important when it comes to this having a goal of the common good, if you look in your charter that follows our treaty, there you see the fundamentals, what we want to make come true. That we are free, equals, that we are equals in dignity. I think you find a lot of sort of real substance as to what it is we're trying to achieve together. The problem is, of course, that very often we discuss things in very simplistic terms. And maybe it's a good thing for Usain Bolt or the new marathon world record holder to be able to summarize their achievement in one number. all their training, all their efforts, all the things they put into being able to do this as fast as possible. But for them, it makes much more sense that it makes sense for us just to put all our efforts into one number. But this is why I think that one should not get rid of the number, but qualify what it is that we're doing, because then we can put systematic changes into effect. And of course, you're right to say that people who dump salaries, who don't take care of the environment, that this is unfair competition. But this is why we have laws on the environment and working conditions and things to protect us against things that causes cancer or provide us or prohibits that we can have children, all the kind of stuff. And these are matters for people who police these things. Because in our democracy, we have taken a stance to say that we will not have social dumping. We will not have ruined environment. So we have a foundation to move on from. And that is what I find to be the promising thing. And suggestions, as Philippe says, as Molly says, that can be put into effect. They can change now. And that would be my appeal for the next 2 days of your discussions, that you also discuss what can we systematically put into effect in order to have a sustainable future, where not only the few feel better, but where it's for not only the many, but for all. Because the discussion in itself doesn't change the world, only things that are put into action.
So a little around the idea of concrete things to do. I mean, as I take it, that is very much the substance of the next 2 days. Is also the substance of the work programme that I lead at the University of Surrey, others that are led elsewhere by these 238 academics. It's the substance of the foundation that Margareta mentioned. Molly gave us a few examples. Interesting, actually, that all of those examples were economic and financial. And I think I think it is actually important to recognize that some of the structural difficulties of doing exactly the things that Margareta and everybody in this room wants to do, of tackling inequality, creating an economy for all, and protecting the environment, have structural impediments that lie within the organization of the economy, of the finance sector, and of the rules and institutions that govern those. So I think that is a particularly important place to look for those strategic, actionable policies. And I agree with some of the ones that she mentioned. I would also add, and this is a reference in a way to the last point that was made by the union representative at the back, that we are living in a different age. If we think we can get by in terms of inequality with an economics that says the wage rate is strictly tied to the labour productivity growth rate, and that labour productivity growth rate is declining, and all our efforts to get growth back separate wage growth even further below the labour productivity growth, we're living in a daydream. We do have to address those fundamental structural issues. We have to actually have an economics of wages and of labour that departs from that consensus in the past if we want to avoid the kind of inequality that we've been getting. So I'm very, very sympathetic to those points. Let me talk very briefly about the word itself. I'm also sympathetic to the idea expressed at the back in this direction about growth doesn't have to be GDP. I mean that's absolutely clear. It doesn't have to be a quantity of stuff through the economy. It doesn't have to be a financial amount that goes through the economy. It doesn't have to be the global output of the world. We don't have to chase that number. We're not marathon runners. And that time, that performance, is not the same for a society with multiple goals as it is for someone pursuing a simple single goal. And it's why the GDP as an indicator is not appropriate to that task. So, and I'm very sympathetic also to this idea that qualitative growth is not just about the quality of goods and services in the economy, it's actually also about the quality of our lives and our own personal development within a society that is also developing a sense of social progress, that does value the commons, that does think of others in the same light as the self, that does build the institutions to protect those common values. And that, I was very interested in this representation that has apparently already been made to the Commission. I'd love to know the answer to your question about this, whether this representation of a value in the common good has reached somehow the places, the audience that you hoped it would reach, because it is very much a part of that conversation. So that idea that we could think about growth differently, absolutely agree with that. I have a couple of puzzles with it, though, and the first is why we should be in, and it's a sort of psychological, philosophical puzzle in a way, why should we be so attached to that word? Why does it matter so much to us? And I just want to pose that really as a question for you as individuals and the meetings in the next couple of days. Because it seems to me that the attachment has a kind of religious significance in modern society. It isn't entirely rational. It isn't entirely structural. It isn't entirely necessary for the formulation of policies about the common good or worker rights or competition policy. But nonetheless, politicians are forced into making some kind of allegiance to this concept in the way that they develop work, and to show that it won't harm growth, to show that our policies for worker representation, for example, for shared models of ownership, for example, for protections of the environment, for example, won't harm growth. And when politicians use that and use that formula, they don't mean it won't harm growth in the ways that we can develop as better people in a fairer society. They mean it very specifically in terms of it won't harm the growth in the GDP. And that's the GDP dependency, the growth fetish that these 238 academics are talking about. They're not talking about growth, in personal growth and development. They're not talking about a better, fairer world. They're not talking about the growth in the common good. They're saying there is a concept, a growth-based language that is beginning to undermine those things because we continually fail to confront this one challenge. The challenge of growth on a finite planet, the challenge of ensuring that people have an equal share of the benefits of the commons and indeed of society, and the challenge of creating a financial system that does not divide society between those who own capital and those who work for the owners of capital. So and that's why, to me, to come finally back to Philippe's challenge to this conference, that's why it's important, I think, to retain the idea that we are in a discussion about a post-growth challenge. There are many people talking about efficiency. There's lots of people talking about the common good. There's all sorts of evidence being gathered about renewable energy. There's lots of work being done in the finance sector. Yes, of course we have to do all those things, but we have to create a space for conversation in which we can address this fundamental challenge. That's what I think Philippe has done.
So in conclusion, let me say thank you to both panelists. I would also think, coming from a different background, the difficulty this agenda will have with the general public is partly to do with communication. It will be partly to do with bigger questions, like this gentleman here indicated about the money economy, because it does have implications. It has huge implications on debt. Will we be able to have debt? What will be relationships, financial relationships? We need to address those. And they need to be addressed in a level of very personal detail. Will I be able to take out a mortgage? Because the mortgages to young people are premised on the idea that their income is growing. growth is coming into debt relationships. I'm not saying it can't be done. I would recommend other language in order to facilitate what you are asking for, rather than challenging the theological belief systems, because they may not be rational, but they exist, and they are hard to overcome. Pragmatism would be I have great agreement with Tim's point, great agreement. I would think language is key and to success. But thank you all, and I wish you great success in the next 2 days discussing these hugely important subjects. Thank you very much.
Thank you.